I did write some things down because I didn't really know I was doing this until 4 hours ago. So I'm delighted to just have had some time with you to walk by the river, walk in the forest, have a bite to eat, and get to know you a little bit, other than through your writing website. So thanks for that initiation at this time. Thank you so much, Frank, for emphasizing gratitude, because that's, for me, one of the most grounding and significant energies that we can join in together. And also, I don't feel like we do enough welcoming in our culture. Can you hear me?
No.
No.
You can use the mic.
I thought I was projecting so well. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now I know you can hear me. I don't feel like we do enough welcoming in our culture. And so I want to welcome each of you for showing up tonight, whatever it took for you to be here and to be really participating in this community in this moment. I know we come from multiple places and backgrounds and beliefs, and I'm imagining that we have many things in common as well, and trust that Jason's guidance will lead us to those places. So I'm going to just read a little bit of what I wrote, or maybe speak it and read it. So I first discovered you, Jason, at an intersection in the Bellingham Herald, of all places. Isabel Kemp, our very beloved climate writer at the Herald, who's no longer living in our community, did an interview with me and Betsy Gross, our beloved co-convener of the Multifaith Network for Climate Justice. And then she reached out to you, Jason, to supplement what we had shared with her in that article. And there's a quote that I'd like, or a few quotes that I'd like to read. The climate, these are from you. The climate crisis is a moral crisis. That means that the climate crisis is a religious issue as much as it is a political, technological, or ecological issue. Different faiths and spiritual worldviews define the relationship between humans and the natural world in contrasting ways. People should talk about how scary it is right now and move to that place of certainty that other people feel the same way. You are not alone, end quote. Do you like those words? It's always lovely to hear yourself quoted, isn't it? So a little bio. Jason's originally from Southern California. His original religious heritage is Mormon, though his path has led him to contemplative Catholicism, among other contemplative practices. He studied anthropology as an undergraduate, has a master's degree in Yale in their forestry and theology program, and this Yale program, and Mary Evelyn Tucker is a strong ally of the Multifaith Network for Climate Justice. And then did a PhD at the University of British Columbia in what you like to call earthy humanities. Yeah, right, right.
See why in a minute. Instead of environmental humanities.
Yeah. And Jason currently teaches environmental humanities courses at Simon Fraser in BC, as well as other universities, including Western Washington University. And he'll be doing a senior seminar there in January that I'm hoping to audit. So you probably want to say a lot more about your journey. I'm ending this with another expression of gratitude, and so look forward to what you're going to share with all of us this evening. And we will have a time where people can ask questions, make comments. after you share what you're going to share.
Yes, thank you very much.
Can everyone see?
All right, is we okay? Good, well, okay, good. All right, so thank you very much for being here. I am overwhelmed with gratitude to see your faces, and for those of you who I have met or haven't met, thank you for trusting me with your evening. And the last thing I want to do actually is talk more about myself, Jillian. So I will, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them later. But what I'd like to do is simply think out loud about an idea that I've been working with for a long time, mostly through the lens of the Catholic monastic tradition. In my dissertation, I studied 4 monastic communities in the American West. So Christ in the Desert, New Clairvaux Abbey, Our Lady of Guadalupe Abbey, and New Camaldoli. So California, 2 in California, 1 in Oregon, 1 in New Mexico. And so my dissertation is primarily about those monks. And if all goes well, and the publishing gods are on my side, there'll be a book. There'll be a book to accompany that coming out sometime next year. But this phrase placefulness came to me after several drafts of that book, actually, as a concise way of talking about what I think it is that the monks do with their properties, and what it is I think would help many of us to ground ourselves for the surge of uncertainty that's certainly coming our way. And so when I say placefulness, I'm not offering you a program. I'm not giving you a refined, 10 steps to a better life. I'm simply thinking out loud about some practices that I think could be added or harmonized with the wonderful work that you're all already doing. Okay, so I hope that's clear. But it's going, yes.
Could you turn up your microphone? It's hard to hear that here. Really? I don't think we're going to be able to eliminate the choir. That would be really hard.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. Okay. Great, thank you. Thank you for letting me know it's back, and I'll try to dial it in a bit. It's just right here, so it's listening to a monitor myself here. So, and I apologize in advance. I'm a brainy person. This is going to be a brainy activity, but it is in the service of our bodies and our places and our spirituality. So please keep that in mind. And then I will wrap it up at 7:45. Is that what we're doing? Yeah. And then we will hopefully have time for some conversation, plenty of space for pushback or supplementary ideas or stories for that. All right, so here we go. There we go. Great. So many of you are probably very familiar with this term mindfulness. It has been in some ways co-opted from Buddhism, but in other ways it has been enlisted, I would say, appreciated. This is great. Yeah, exactly, backup seekers. Right. It has been enlisted by the well-being movement, which is much broader than the sectarian Buddhism or Hinduism that it was born within. So mindfulness, of course, is this practice of being aware of what arises in any given moment in our minds and our bodies and our emotions without passing judgment or evaluating, right? That's the trick of mindfulness. And it has been used in prisons, it's been used in schools, it's been used in stress reduction programs, anxiety therapy, right? It has many different incarnations, if you will. And what I've been noticing recently is that some authors have picked up on this fullness, as I'm saying, time, right? So there's a book called Bodyfulness by Christine Caldwell, which is calling people into this somatic practice of contemplation, getting down out of our headspaces. There's a wonderful book that just came out recently about timefulness. So a geologist named Marcia Bjornenrud, who's talking about how important it is to embed ourselves in the geological time frame, right? We live in deep time, and our bodies have responded to the seasons of deep time, right? The shape of our bodies, the shape morphology of the ecosystems that we call home. So timefulness is another interesting variation on this, right? And so reading her book actually is probably where I connected this to my own work around sense of place, how we form relationships to place. And so placefulness then, with this sort of working definition, right? Contemplative practice of attending to what is and what arises in our places, right? So not only a kind of cultural and ecological literacy, but a kind of readiness for the troubled times, right? A relationship with place that is prepared to suffer with, right? Even if that means smoky skies and clear cuts and wildfires and droughts and pine beetle and climate change and shifting mosaics of species, right? That is at least what I'm proposing could come out of something like this. And so let's just hold that loosely in our minds as a possible definition with lots of nuance and experience that we'll dig into. But let me take you on a crash course of this idea of place and sense of place, okay? So hold on, right? So going back to the 4th century BCE, Archytas, cited by Aristotle, says to be, right? To exist at all is to be placed, right? To be in place. The 19th and 20th century philosophers really tried to move us from place to space, to 3-dimensional geometric kind of equalitarian space, right? So we were in a coordinates of space, but place has a kind of gravity of its own. To be is to exist in a context, in a place. And in its spiritual dimension, Simone Weil, the mystic, says that to be rooted in a place is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. So many of us who feel existential angst or have always had a sense in the back of our minds of not quite being at home might feel a bit of longing at hearing this phrase, because we can relate to it, but yet have perhaps not always been able to find it. And certainly, I am no one to come up here and tell you to pick your place and stick to it, because I've lived all over the country. So I absolutely wrestle with this myself. But what I can try to say in one slide is simply that something goes wrong in every generation, but something that went wrong with modernity was this shift away from places to these projects of efficiency, of technology, of mobility. And for many settler people from Europe who rode a wave of genocide and exploitation, trying to find a better life, many of our elders and ancestors, there was a kind of nagging, gnawing sense of homelessness that came across the plains with us. And my Mormon parents have genealogy back to Adam. I mean, it's just so much genealogy, right? But there's never very many generations that are in one place, right? Salt Lake, Missouri, and then it's New York, Massachusetts, Kentucky, southern England, France, Denmark, right? It's all over the place. Where are the bones of my ancestors? The bones of my ancestors are scattered across this country and Europe. So I can really relate to this notion from Vincent Vicinius, who says that we are, in a sense, homeless in our attempt to domesticate and to rule the natural world. And so in a way, we live in a kind of place impairment, right? In the sense that our places are places of convenience, they're place markers, they're investments, they're gathering spaces, but they're not necessarily places in that deep trans-species kind of way. And of course, you can see this in the postmodern architecture, right? That we try to mimic some sense of domesticity or town-centeredness. They will call a small urbanization a town center that's on the periphery of a suburb, right? They are trying to capitalize on this sense of homelessness, this sense of longing for a place, for center, for home. And so many of our cultural projects in modernity, especially in North America, have been projects of arrival, of homecoming. So for example, the agrarians, the agriculturalists, as they moved across the country, had in the back of their minds the archetypes of the biblical Eden. They were trying to return home to a story that was about homelessness, right? Being evicted from the garden. Adam and Eve were rendered homeless. And you could say that Western civilization has constantly and always been trying to get back to the garden. So modernity, our technology, our garden cities have almost always been a project of arrival, of trying to get back home to the garden. And the irony or the strangeness of this is that the flip side is simply the mirror image of this. So the wilderness, the longing for wildness, wilderness is not necessarily an arrival home the way John Muir thinks of it. It's an arrival to an inverse of the civilized, an inverse of the city. So, Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson's notion, right? And so someone like John Muir could go to Yosemite and feel like he was home, but then write all of these nasty things about indigenous peoples, right, in his journals. So there was this very strange erasure of the people, places who called these places home to create our national park system, right? So that's something we might want to circle back to. The strangeness of inverting that binary from agrarian project where we need to redeem the wilderness by cultivating it to this complete reversal, which says it's the wilderness that does the redeeming. Leave it alone, don't touch it, get out. You're not home here. You're never at home here. You're never welcome here. The US Wilderness Act says that humans are supposed to be a guest in the wilderness, right? And that is the exact opposite of home, of place, as you'll see in the coming slides. And Wendell Berry, an agrarian writer, but definitely someone who has thought quite a lot about place, would frame it this way. So when I put up big block text of quotes, just wait for me because I'm going to read it and you can read it with me, okay? And so, and if it's this big, you know it's good, right? It's not, you know it's good because Wendell Berry really comes at us. And I feel indicted by this quote. So it's definitely one of those that hits home. He says, right, he's speaking to environmentalists, he's speaking to ecologists, he's speaking to all of us in the West. He says, no settled family or community has ever called its home place an environment. None has ever called its feeling for its home place biocentric or anthropocentric, right? Academic words that I love. None has ever thought of its connection to its home place as ecological, deep or shallow. The concepts and insights of the ecologists are of great usefulness in our predicament, and we can hardly escape the need to speak of ecology and ecosystems. But the terms themselves are culturally sterile. They come from the juiceless, abstract intellectuality of the universities, which was invented to disconnect, displace, and disembody the mind. The real names of the environment are the names of rivers and river valleys, creeks, ridges, and mountains, towns and cities, lakes, woodlands, lanes, roads, creatures, and people, right? So an ecosystem is a word that was invented by homeless people to talk about a place that they longed to feel at home within. And that hurts, that stinks, because I talk about forest ecosystems all the time, right? But this is at least the objection I'm raising to myself when I say placefulness, right? Placefulness. So what do some, in a general way, what are some cultures capable of in terms of placefulness or connection to place? Let me give you a few examples that are publicly available. So I'm accessing ethnographies that are publicly available and in no way claiming to speak on behalf of Indigenous people. And certainly the traditional peoples of this place, I would never tell their stories in public. I just wouldn't tell their stories except in the few instances of place names that I'll have in a few slides. So let me speak in broad strokes here. Animism is a word that academics invented to try to describe the worlding of Indigenous peoples who lived in a setting in which all things had a kind of personhood, that soul was taken for granted, that person-to-person relationships were not just presumed to be human to human, right? Culture and nature are not two different domains, right? Everything is hybrid, everything is culture nature, right? Personhoods can be salmon, mountain, ancestor, right? This very abstract circle simply suggests that this is a whole, not two domains, but a whole in which relationships connect between persons, mountains, rivers, salmons, ancestors, gods, goddesses, spirits, transformers, and otherwise, right? With me so far? Animism. And this is me talking about a way of life as a world, not as a belief system or a worldview, but as a world that includes human and non-human persons. Now, those very complex webs of relationships between persons, so the etiquette of a family who has custodianship over a particular salmon run, they will eat the salmon, right? They're related to the salmon, but they're going to eat the salmon. They're related to the whales, but they're going to eat the whales. So this is a very foreign concept to the Western imagination that wants to, as soon as we grant something personhood, we want to, sign up for Amnesty International and give them human rights, like all the things that a human deserves, this person deserves as well. That's not how personhood works in animist cosmologies, right? Personhood is a reciprocity of life and death that includes your life and your death, right? That is nourished by the life and the death of other persons, right? So this is me talking about animism that many Indigenous people would take for granted. And that's coming through my translation, right? So in a real sense, an Indigenous or an animist sense of place is the taken for granted idea that belonging to a place is to dwell there. To dwell there is to belong to the place, right? The place nourishes and you nourish the place through complex webs of reciprocity, relationship. And some of the most beautiful examples of this that are available in public are one, the ethnography by Keith Basso, who studied with the Western Apache and who learned from the Western Apache through his ethnographic writing how very simple descriptive place names that were assigned to, affordances of the landscape like rocks and trees, and were used to mark tasks and travel byways. How these very descriptive place names could accumulate moral lessons and therefore reflect back or teach Western Apache people how to be Western Apache people. Okay, so for example, I won't pronounce the Western Apache, but the place name translates to big cottonwood trees stand here and there. So that's just a very descriptive place name, right? This is that place. That place name would be identifiable by most of the kin groups and clans in the city or in the group, and that those place names would then begin to accumulate stories. Okay, so the place name would then draw in things that had happened in and around that place, and those stories would be used as lessons. And so in Western Apache, for example, if you wanted to reprimand someone for something they had done, you wouldn't necessarily have to go through all the details of the story. You'd simply have to, point your finger and say the place name, right? These are strong place names that had a kind of teaching or pedagogical role. So they live in a moral landscape where not only do their personal memories attach, but their people's memories attach, and those places teach them how to people, right? So for example, a woman whose daughter had recently married, she had gone to live with the father's family, and she came to check on her just to see how things were going. In Western Apache etiquette, that was way too soon to check on the daughter. That was a faux pas. And she ended up stumbling into a Pima raid and was killed. And so that story of this woman coming to check on the daughter-in-law too soon after the marriage was shot like an arrow at people who transgressed social boundaries, right? So you see what I mean here, how places can accumulate lesson and story and then be sort of shortened into these small moral lessons, all right? So there's another example, but I need to move along. One of his interlocutors says, Dudley, he says, wisdom sits in places. It's like water that never dries up. You need to drink water to stay alive, don't you? Well, you also need to drink from places. You must remember everything about them. You must learn their names. You must remember what happened at them long ago. You must think about it and keep on thinking about it. Right? The places teach them how to be. A wonderful author from England named Robert Macfarlane. He's a great writer you may have read, but he's done a lot with the sort of rich vocabularies of land-based peoples in the Atlantic Isles, so England and Scotland and Wales and the Hebrides and such. And he has been collecting these words as a kind of word hoard, he calls it, right? As he's gathering these words as the work on the land dries up, we start to lose our vocabulary. So it isn't just, placefulness then isn't necessarily just about an aesthetic appreciation, but a taskscape. What do we do on land, right? And this is one of the reasons I'm very interested in sustainable forestry, right? It is part of how we can work with the land. So for example, a Devon word, amil, is the word for this thin film of ice that freezes, right, on the leaves. That's what they call it, right? Or the Rionak Maya, I think that's how you say it, is the shadow cast on the moorlands by clouds moving across the sky on a bright and windy day, right? And you can probably all imagine that, but now, right, there's this word for it. And Macfarlane points out that in one edition of the Oxford Young Adult Dictionary, they deleted a whole bunch of land-based words, right? Acorn, adder, ash, beech, bluebell, etc. But they added all of these important words for technological literacy, right? Attachment, log graph, blog, broadband, bullet point, right? So he's tracking this loss of literacy on the land and this increase in technological literacy that we've been seeing. All right, so the Moreland vocabulary is not just place names, it's also names for activities, for tasks, for labor, for work. And actually, there's a really interesting article in the notes here that I can send along that talks about how the heath, the heather, actually lured early humans into this symbiotic relationship that requires humans to burn every 12 years or so. Very interesting idea that actually humans were lured into a mutual domestication with heather, which I find totally fascinating. Another kind of an example that just blows my mind every time I think about it is this example written about by Bruce Chatwin in The Song Lines, which, you know, the book is maybe geared more towards a popular audience, but he does some really good work documenting what he calls song lines, right? This is rooted in the Australian Aboriginal notion of the dream time, right? This sort of mythical when the totem or the first ancestor of everybody's lineage emerged from the earth and began forming the landscape of the continent. So a person's dreaming is their first ancestor. So it's not the symbol, it's not their mascot, it is their ancestor. It's who they descend from. So that could be a kangaroo, a lizard, a bandicoot, honey badger, or honey ant or badger. Not honey badger, that's a different thing, right? And so each person has a dreaming. And if an Aboriginal man is initiated into his clan, he will receive a portion of the song line. The song line is the line or the song that the ancestors sung as they formed the landscape. Just like completely gorgeous, imagining this, right? And so imagine an Australian public works team coming along and building a road or cutting a forest or mining for anything. How absolutely, demoralizing it would be to see your piece of the song line destroyed in that way. And he writes about it this way, and you really get a sense of what he means here. He says, regardless of the words, it seems the melodic contour of the song describes the nature of the land over which the song passes. So imagine like the grooves of a record player. So if Lizard Man were dragging his heels across the salt pans of Lake Eyre, you could expect a succession of long flats like Chopin's Funeral March. Certain phrases, certain combinations of musical notes are thought to describe the action of the ancestors' feet. One phrase would say salt pan, another creek bed, spinifex, sandhill, muckle scrub, rock face, and so forth. An expert songman, by listening to their order in succession, would count how many times his hero crossed a river or scaled a ridge and be able to calculate where and how far along a song line he was. Even in different languages, they can, using the melody and tempo of these song lines, can circumnavigate the bush using the song lines. So, I mean, that is the high like watermark in my book for the ability to embed oneself in place through the understanding of the world as animistic, as belonging to that world, right? So definitely worth exploring that book. Now, some publicly available sacred places or cultural sites from where I live in Vancouver in British Columbia are what we call transformer sites. So in the worlds of the Coast Salish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples of southern British Columbia, this word shayas, which I can't really say, the X is like this very hard to pronounce lisp with the tongue, and I can't say it, but it's something like shayas. And that's the Squamish word for the transformer, right? There's the Lummi equivalent up here. But if you've been to Vancouver, you've noticed the lions, the two lions in Coast Salish worlds. Those are the twin sisters, and they were transformed by the transformer spirit into the stones to immortalize their contribution to a peace treaty. If you've been to Squamish, you've seen this Stalmus chief, which was an ancient longhouse where humans and animals gathered for ceremony. It was transformed into the granite mountain that we see today. If you've been to Stanley Park, Skull Shrock was a chief who was purifying himself in the ocean before his child was born. And he was confronted by 4 sort of mysterious beings in a canoe and he refused to get out of their way. And they were impressed by his dedication to the purification ritual. And so they immortalized him in this small, what's in geologic terms, this volcanic intrusion, right? But for Coast Salish people is a monument to pure fatherhood. Obsidian deposits in the region were understood to be the lightning bolts, the strikes from the eyes of Thunderbird, right? So many significant land features throughout Canada have these transformer site quality, right? Because of the correspondences they have to certain anthropomorphic or animal shape. And they've been integrated into the lore of these peoples. What we sometimes call Mount Baker has a long history of plural names and naming. And actually at the end, I'm curious what folks think about the idea of renaming Mount Baker. But right, many people call it Culshan as sort of short honorific for the Coast Salish languages, the several iterations on White Mountain or White Sentinel. But one of the names that I like is that the Spanish likened it to a Carmelite monk, so La Gran Montaña del Carmelo. And so that to me sticks out as an interesting nomer. And of course, the Spanish up and down the coast named their places after significant events, the feast days and the saints of the Catholic faith. Where I'm from, many of our place names are Catholic. And then of course the English, they just like to name things after each other, right? So George Vancouver said, hey Baker, I'm gonna name this one after you, right? So, and that has its own logic to it, right? Honoring colleagues by naming things after them. That's one way to see it. What's that?
Lots of white men.
Oh yeah, yeah. They like to honor each other. It's part of their MO. All right, and this is actually this phrase. I want you to sit with this phrase a little bit, and maybe I could have probably brought this in a little earlier, but. Giselle Martin is an activist in and around Tofino, Neutral Youth territory, and she reminds activists all the time that in the Neutral Youth language, they don't actually have a word for wilderness. So this project that I referenced earlier about wilderness as a place where we go as visitors is a completely foreign concept to animist placefulness, right? Old growth forests with these towering cedar trees, in many cases, are overgrown orchards in a sense, because they have been modified, managed for thousands of years by indigenous people for the bounty, the gifts, right? The lore around red cedar is that red cedar was once a very generous man who was transformed into the cedar for his generosity, because this tree of life is continually giving to Coast Salish and Neutral peoples. So this is a very interesting thing to say to a lot of my friends who feel like wilderness and sacred are synonymous. And so I'd love to come back and hear folks' reactions to this notion, and it will make sense as I go along, kind of what I'm calling for here. All right. I want to do a brief tour through Judaism and Christianity. I could do a whole evening on sense of place and place names in the Bible. I won't. But so the Hebrew Bible is, in a sense, a series of place names strung together with the stories that explain them, right? If you read closely, each major scene is connected in some way to place. And these places were connected directly to access to the divine, and they were monuments and lesson, right? They were places of encounter with the divine, right? So Jacob wrestling the angel called the place facing, or the face of God, because he wrestled with the angel and struggled with the angel and saw, in some sense, the face of God. So these places are named after these encounters, right? Jacob's well, or Sinai, or Carmel, or Mount Tabor. All of them have some sacred significance, either as divine encounters or as some kind of recapitulation of sacred history, like Mount Tabor with the transfiguration of Jesus. In addition, we see that each of these places is related to the motif of wilderness on the one hand, and the paradise garden on the other, right? As I mentioned earlier, it seems as though the agrarian and the wilderness project in the West is a kind of reiteration of this biblical theme, right? That goes all the way back to the first chapter of Genesis, where the mythical first parents, right? Adam, earth, Eva, life, are exiled from the garden and the rest of the Bible is the chosen people trying to return to the Bible, or to the garden, not the Bible, to the garden. Biblical peoples attempting to return to the garden. And so the prophet Isaiah, when he's admonishing the people, he says, Adonai will surely comfort Zion and will look with compassion on all her ruins. He will make her deserts like Eden, her wastelands like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her in thanksgiving and the sound of singing, right? So the deserts will become like Eden. That is classic theological language that ties the covenant and the obedience with the place, the state of the land. And absolutely, there's a tension, right? The monotheistic redactors of the Bible are constantly skeptical of places, especially if they're associated with goddesses or, gods of fertility. So I'm not trying to overly romanticize the Hebrew sense of place, but it's absolutely there. But it's also in tension with this strict monotheism that sees God as totally transcendent and other, right? That's at least pushing that way. But what the Bible absolutely does is preserve much of the animistic tendency of the pre and sort of early pastoralism. All right, I'm going to skip St. Anthony, I'm sorry, jump into monastic sense of place. My dissertation, this is Brother John, he died a few years after my dissertation work was complete, but he was the cellarer for Our Lady of Guadalupe. And he joined the monastery as a lay brother because he wanted to farm. That was his whole thing. He wanted to be a monk that farmed. And he worked for, I think he was in the monastery 60 years or so. And when I lived at the monastery for a month or so, I worked with Brother John every morning, and he was tougher and stronger and faster than I was at 85, right? I mean, it was amazing. But monasticism is an attempt to live as a kind of allegory, or a kind of embodied allegory of Christ in the desert, to go out into the desert and to pray. And so even the agricultural monasteries see themselves as kind of living alone together. And so they take a vow of stability, right? That vow of stability anchors them to a particular place. Not only do they vow to the other brothers, they vow to the place. Stability means not, staying put. And so what I studied was basically how this vow of stability, this admonition to become, as one Cistercian puts it, lovers of the place, which is a wonderful phrase. I studied how those seasonal and daily liturgies anchored them to the place, and all of the ways in which their biblical symbolism and imagination populated that experience of place. Their manual work, their walks, right? In many ways, like the Western Apache, the monks of these monasteries, memories and experiences, and even what one monk called charged moments, these kind of unexpected encounters with the divine on the land, register themselves with the place. And so you live in a place for 60 years, you are already starting to develop that deep memory that oftentimes we only talk about and attribute to indigenous peoples. So just a few examples, photographs are all mine. You become part of the land. Our vow of stability grounds us. And an image that was really helpful for me was the idea of these trees taking root. You know, we've got 30 feet of topsoil unproven. The roots go deep. So that was the image of stability that I had. The longer I stay here, the more I can see myself growing in ways I never thought possible. It's of course not always easy staying in one place, but the longer you can stay, the higher you can reach. And so the Psalms, which they chant incessantly 7 times a day, it becomes a kind of vocabulary, a symbolic landscape, right? He says, the top quote here, the monk from Christ in the Desert, he says, any monk who has spent his life chanting the divine office cannot have any experience and not have it reflect, not given utterance in the psalmody. The psalmody is a great template to place on the world for understanding it, and its language becomes your own. And another monk is an example of that. He got lost in a snowstorm at his own monastery and he couldn't find his way back for a while. And he was like genuinely afraid. And he said of that, he said, the Psalm 111, which talks about the fear of God, he says, it took on a whole different meaning for me and a whole different depth. And when I say that Psalm now, I immediately connect with that experience I had out there in the wilderness. So the symbolism of the Psalms populates the concepts of the land, but then the experiences on the land shape the symbol. See how that's kind of a two-way street? The symbols come from the biblical imagery, but then the experiences populate the symbols. And this one's a bit more embodied. He says, this Douglas fir was just alive. Really, there was this gash and sap dripping out of it. Immediately, I thought of Christ, his side, the gash and the blood and water flowing from his side. And I remembered touching it. And it was a very holy moment. My eyes were kind of opened to the experience of God, that God is always with us. We're the ones that just don't always see it. And then I tried that next day and went back, and it was not the same. It was alive, but the light wasn't there. I'll never forget that tree. So it's not to say that he's playing merely in a symbolic reading of the tree. Certainly the symbols were there, but there was an affective quality to the tree that was gone the next day, right? So there's this kind of what we would call an academy's phenomenology to it, right? This embodied experience to it all. All right. All right, how are you doing so far? All right, we're 15 minutes. Yeah, it might happen. It might actually happen. So what I'm drawing out of this, right? And obviously in the book I go into way more detail about the symbolism and mechanics of the monastic sense of place, and how it is in many ways not dissimilar from an atomistic or indigenous depth of dwelling in place, though certainly the theology is different. But that, in fact, what may be called for in a time of crisis and change and climate change is a deepening of this sense of place, this attunement, this awareness, this literacy to our places. There's a lot of different ways we can talk about it. Douglas Christie, who wrote an encyclopedic history of the early desert fathers and contemplation, talks about it as a contemplative ecology or a spiritual ecology. But his kind of method, or his insistence, is that the ecological sciences and the spiritual symbols complement each other, right? So this double insight that spiritual thought and practice is immeasurably enriched through being situated within the natural world, and that ecological understanding is given added depth and meaning by extending the ecological field to include traditions of spiritual thought and practice, comprises the heart of the emerging spiritual ecology that he writes about, right? So yes to learning the names of species, yes to learning the cycles of the land, but also yes to understanding the spiritual symbols of trees within your particular spiritual tradition, or intuiting those symbols through your own embodied experience in the forest. But there's a caution, right? So I don't know if anyone has ever been to like a eco-spirituality retreat or like a wild church, and you're sitting in a circle and they say, okay, now I want you to go out into the forest and find an object and then come back and talk about it. You have 5 minutes, you know, there's almost this frenzy to extract meaning from the forest. And so my absolute immediate caution to that, I couldn't say this better, but Belden Lane, he's a theologian, he says, so again, I'm all about the symbols. I'm all about these sort of archetypal and theological depth and you know, complexities. But even that can turn into a kind of exploitation, right? He says the challenge is to honor the thing itself as well as the thing is metaphor, right? When Ralph Waldo Emerson declared in 1836 that every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact, he sent people racing to the woods, anticipating the voice of God and the call of every thrush. But too often, they paid scant attention to the songbird in their anxiousness to hear some transcendent message. They returned home full of nothing but themselves, their pockets stuffed with metaphors. Relentlessly for a timeless interior soulscape, it is easy to sail over the specificity of particular landscapes. Guilty, right? Like I have raced into the woods just like ready to get spiritual, right? And I've sat in many circles where I've been admonished to go find something significant in my experience. No expectations, right? You need to go into the forest to learn the names of the species, but also to just sit with the things themselves, right? And no structure, no expectation, right? Both and, right? All right, so this is as practical as I could get. This is it right here. This is the slide where I'm like, do a thing, right? And I mean, I wish I had 10 more like it, but my brain thinks in these sort of trends and ideas and archaeologies and genealogies. But, you know, channeling this advice from Belden Lane and Douglas Christie and the monks, right? And my understanding of Indigenous cosmology without, you know, appropriating any of the particulars. I like to talk about the liturgy of place, and liturgy is that word we use in, you know, high church circles to talk about the season of the Christian calendar, right? The liturgy that goes from, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the darkest time of the year is the time when the sun is reborn, and we move through the cycle of the year and then come towards the spring, right? When the land has died, gone to sleep, and is about to resurrect, right? There's a real powerful paschal dimension to ecology in the Northern Hemisphere. That's what I mean by liturgy. And by liturgy of the land, I mean the cycles of the places that we call home, whether it's, you know, if you're from desert places, it's going to be different. But in our part of the world, in Cascadia, in the rainforest, the liturgy of the land has a particular quality to it. And this October, as I've been calling it, has been a time of great anxiety as my body anticipated, right, the return of the wet weather, right? And going for a walk that first day when finally the cool, wet air was here felt like a relief, right? So here are just lots of different ways that I'm continually wrestling with literacies in these places, but learning the cycles of the stars, right? When is Orion in the sky, on the south, in the southern sky, right? And for how long, right? Where are we? I don't even know. Where are we with the moon cycle right now? I've lost track. Are we waxing? Are we waning? We're in the moon, right? So that was a quiz. You all passed and I failed. Even astrologies, right? This is part of your wheelhouse. The archetypal depth and the mythological depth of astrologies and their stories, their star stories, is a literacy that I find quite compelling, like learning the stories behind the stars from Greek myths, the cycles of the weather, right? How do you know, how can you be attuned to the perturbations of climate change without a baseline literacy in the what to expect in the short term and the longer term, like El Nino, La Nina. The cycles of local food and regional food, medicinal plants and fungi, right? Right now, as people are out in the woods hunting mushrooms, right? They're probably all surging in places because of the dry October. I went to a, Mycological Society of Vancouver meeting, and they were all expecting to have been out, right? But they couldn't because of the dry weather. The same goes for topography, superficial geology. Around here, a lot of the influence is tectonic and glacial, right? Learning the nuances of that is a lifelong project. I challenge myself to learn the Latin and at least the common names of trees. I'm working on those. In some cases, indigenous names, if it's appropriate. But that to me is a lifelong project of getting to know particular plants and people and animal people and fungal people in your places. And then developing these rituals or memories or lessons that are tied to particular places, right? So maybe journaling about particular experiences or reflecting on significant places in your own past, even if they're not in the vicinity. What are the places where my most significant events have taken place? And so sometimes that can change, right? If you've ever been living in a city and then gone through a really messy breakup, the landscape of the city completely changes. And the places that you avoid, that you used to just pass without a thought, now you avoid, right? Because they're associated with the depth of that heartbreak, right? And of course, we have to end talking about what we're going to do about the long history of expropriation and genocide of indigenous peoples. So one of the problems with wilderness is that it erases that history of place, right? One of the problems with Western civilization, both its agrarian and wilderness iterations, is that they're projects of erasure, of purification, right? If we want to restore an ecosystem, we usually mean the functioning ecosystem without any humans that participate in that. So that language of ecosystem that both Wendell Berry challenges, I also think may be problematic from this placefulness perspective. We need to think about what a reconciled landscape might look like. How does our sense of place include the heartbreak and the blood and the pain of indigenous peoples? For some of us, we may not be able to stomach it and may want to leave. I mean, that's certainly an option, but for others, we may need to become allies. We may need to donate to indigenous organizations. We may need to advocate for movements like Land Back, right? Where we're talking about returning much of the traditional territories of treaty and treaty process kinds of indigenous peoples. So I've got a couple of resources on that front. But I want to talk, well, actually, let me just share this quote. It's from a Seattle newspaper recently from Hanford McLeod, who's an Nisqually councilman. He says, for me, a land acknowledgement is land back, right? So at Simon Fraser University, where I teach, everyone gets their land acknowledgement, and then we move on with the proceedings. I think every time a settler person gives a land acknowledgement, they should donate $100 to an Indigenous organization. And for many Indigenous people, they're quite grateful to hear it, but they want to keep the conversation going. How can we make good on moving beyond an acknowledgement? And he's quite blunt, right? He says, a land acknowledgement is to give it back, the land back. You give us land, and we'll acknowledge the fact that you're on our land. You stole the land, you manipulated the land, and now we're here to fix that. Thanks, right? Those are hard words for me to hear, right? But they're words that those are hard words and hard truths that a practice of placefulness is going to try to wrap its arms around, right? Try to wrap its arms around, try to sit with that grief and see what it does to us, right? And I don't have the answer to that. I have two suggestions. One would be to have a look at this map, right? Native land or any map. I mean, you can zoom in, obviously this is quite messy looking, but Indigenous territories are in many ways overlap. But another thing would be to find trustworthy organizations that you either know have allies in or trust. But one is the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. They have a 100% rating on Charity Navigator, which is like a, what do you call it? Like a third party monitor of nonprofits. And this is what they do, right? They help Indigenous people reclaim and manage their traditional territories. In Canada, in the next few generations, British forestry in British Columbia is going to look very different. We are completely transforming the way forestry is done by either setting up co-management strategies or outright rights and title to traditional territories. So these are conversations that we should at least be aware of and support where we can. But our practice of placefulness, which can develop this rich spiritual connection, which can develop this ecological literacy, needs to include this piece of cultural awareness of the sacred sites of traditional peoples and being able to sit with the discomfort of the sins of our settler colonial ancestors, right? All right, one left. Okay. The Greek root for the word crisis, right, is rooted in the idea of the Greek for the word decision. And it was often invoked at a time when the disease was at a decisive turning point, when it could take the person's life or they could turn towards healing. We are in a moment of crisis, right? And that in many ways could be a blessed thing if it becomes a moment of transformation. And that in moments of transformation can be messy and they can be hard and they can be painful. But it may be the case that we have to, and our children or grandchildren have to pass through a few generations of trouble before we get back to it. But I would say that a practice of placefulness is not about, getting ours and turning it into our own little corner of paradise. It may include that, but it's also about the willingness to suffer with the places as we move through this bottleneck. So words like nostalgia, Glenn Albrecht, a philosopher in Australia, coined the term solastalgia, right? It's combining a Latin and a Greek root, which I don't know if you can do that. No, you can't. But he said it's basically a form of this mental anguish over a place that's changing before your eyes, not a place that you miss or long for, but a place that's changing before your eyes. So placefulness is an awareness of that. It's not just all the warm and fuzzy feelings that we associate with our beloved places, but the hard stuff too. And two wonderful activists I would flag for you, Donna Haraway, whose book Staying with the Troubles is a very unique admonition to do just that. And Trevey Johnson, who was a wilderness guide, encouraging people to make art and acts of beauty in places that have been damaged, right? Re-inhabiting damaged places like clear cuts, right? Or chemical plant, closed down chemical plants, not like nuclear plants, but, places that have been damaged, right? And her project is called Radical Joy for Hard Times, right? So those are just two of many potential resources. But this practice of placefulness could look very different for different people. But for me, it's a spiritual depth, it's an ecological literacy, and it's a willingness to suffer with our places. All right, just a few minutes over.
Stop your share now. We got you.
Stop share. All right. All right. So let's open it up to conversation. And will the Zoom record people's voices, or did they need to speak into the microphone?
No, here's the microphone.
You got that. Okay, great. So if you want to continue the conversation, let's have some questions first, and then maybe we can get into comments and statements after that. Question? Yeah.
Just a quick answer. When you mentioned Adam and Eve, you linked Eve with the word life. I missed the word you linked with Adam.
Adama, Adam is earth, soil.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned that some ancients had the goal in creating universities to disconnect the mind.
That was Wendell Berry's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could explain that, because as a university teacher,
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
I did not want that to happen.
No. So he's referring to the kind of the roots of university education, which tended to favor the abstract over the embodied, right? The universal over the particular, right? So much more Platonic than Aristotelian, right?
And getting down to the nitty-gritty and what we can do to change them.
Yeah, and at universities, like you and I would hope that that's not always the case, right? He's indicting me for being, quite highfalutin in our language, but I do think there's a place for precise language. The trouble is that sometimes we use it to distance ourselves, right, from particulars, right? And so, what's his name? Stephen Buhner, if you guys know him. He's a plant guy. He wrote a book called Earth Grief. And so along the lines of Barry's comment that academia tends to disconnect us, even the way we talk about climate grief can be at a distance. If you read academic articles about climate grief, you feel this distance, right? One begins to feel feelings of sadness, right? And so that's one of the reasons he uses earth grief instead of climate or ecological anxiety. He's trying to get as low to the ground as he can with those wordings. And that really resonates with Wendell Berry's notion that our connection to places are through the names, the place names, not just words like ecosystem, which if you think about it, it is culturally neutral. And that is shocking to me sometimes. Right? Yes.
Jason, this is a struggle I held as I listened to.
Can you hold the microphone over?
Yeah, you want to come on up?
Jason, my struggle as I listened to what was a gift of a presentation, because it was clear and there were thoughts that were new to me and all that. So I was holding almost this sense of comfort in learning with an embodied, growing struggle of holding that the IPCC reports are using superlatives upon superlatives now about the rate of climate destruction. And so what I'm feeling is kind of a confusion over the sense of what you're inviting us to is this sense of expansiveness. That's my sense, of placefulness. But it seems like a place of luxury too, given the momentum of earth suffering, people suffering in this moment. And so holding this, possibly just my work to do, but it seems important to love and grieve and engage as if we really do believe what scientists are telling us.
I join you in that wrestle, that struggle between contemplation and action. And I think that many scientists are feeling waves of grief over inaction. There was a parody film about this recently called Don't Look Up.
Yeah.
Where the scientists said, literally, there's an asteroid coming towards the Earth. And all the media cycles just spun it around. And there was this whole movement to not look up, right? I mean, that's the kind of trouble that we're in, right? And so the scientists who are burning out, the scientists who are feeling this despair, right, are the ones perhaps who have thrown up their hands and given up on something. And maybe it's too late for some thresholds. And I think that mindfulness and placefulness are not simply practices of leisure, which certainly sometimes comes across that way, but they're practices of presence, even in the superlatives, right? Those superlatives are coming at all of us right now, right? And what we do with them, or how we receive them, I think, is what's going to get us through it, in a sense. And you probably have a better answer to your wrestle than I do, but maybe we'll come back to it. But that's what I would offer, just off the top of my mind, is that not contemplation over action, not quietism over realism, but a kind of engaged contemplation that looks those superlatives in the eye. Yes?
So on your website, I looked at your website.
Holyscapes.org.
And you, yes, holyscapes.org. And you said there we are reclaiming the holiness of the world. Thomas Berry, the great work, and how a deeper sense of the world's holiness might contribute to healing our hearts and the ecosystems. The word place, I did not hear in your to-do list. Find the holiness, develop a sense of the holiness or the sacredness of place. Would you add that as something important or not?
I mean, absolutely, I do. The sense of place, well, in the biblical sense, or in my own Catholic tradition, something I like about the Catholic contemplatives and the mystics is that they hold tension and space for both the transcendence and the immanence of God, right? God is beyond or more than the universe, but also God is intimately present to each person, each thing. And so to me, cultivating a sense of intimacy and literacy with place is a religious practice for me, right? And I think that, I would absolutely add, I guess, if we wanted to be more specific about that. But I don't know if I would. Yeah, I think it's open to everyone's approach. Not everyone is going to come to a practice of, ecosystem restoration, or to even to learning the names of plants as a particularly sacred activity, even though many of us may, right? So it's definitely open to that. Yes, that was not a good answer. Yes.
Well, I'm kind of building on the earlier comment. How would you use placefulness and contemplation to deal with the air quality we were having 3 days ago as an example of the reality of our troubled times? I'm asking for some example, I guess, of how this works.
Well, I mean, a placefulness reaction to the dirty air for me was like anxiety. I was feeling quite anxious about it, right? And I was trying not to be, trying not to feel apocalyptic, but it isn't that you, the thing to not do, I would say, is to ignore it, right? Because it's, or to say that when the air is bad, well, when the air is better, then I will be placeful, or then I can have a connection with the forest when it gets better, right? So a practice of placefulness is really inhabiting the worry and the sadness over that, but also putting it in a broader historical or cultural context, right? Like, for example, I don't know if this is the case, but Indigenous people did a whole lot of burning as part of their food systems management. They may have lived with similar amounts of smoke for certain seasons of the year. And that isn't to justify it or to brush it to the side, but just to put it into a broader historical context. Is that helpful at all? I mean, you're wrestling with it as good as mine, right? Really. All I would say is that the practice doesn't stop when you're uncomfortable or not, you know, it isn't optimal conditions.
Well, it seems like it's helpful to talk about it with others.
Yes.
And to acknowledge this is real and this is hard.
And this is real and this is hard. And I wanted to go to the forest today, but I probably won't because the smoke is too bad. And that makes me really sad.
And while I'm hiding in my house, there's a lot of creatures that are out there in it.
Yeah.
We can't go away.
Yes, yes, sir.
It's a big topic, but when we have people that are place-based, I remember in a rural newspaper I used to get, a woman said, I've moved to this place. We've been here for 2 years. I'm still not accepted. What can I do? The people were place-based, you know, and you have to make the second and third effort. Finally, you know, and we have a tendency in the country today of people to move together with like-minded people and have an affinity around place and not trust other people. And most people live in cities. How can, I think for the environment, we need like the city kids coming out in the woods and building pathways and things like they're doing so that they can expand their sense of place. It's it needs to be an expansive topic, not a condensing topic, you know?
Absolutely, very well said, yeah. And this is something I would have loved to talk more about in terms of some of the don'ts of placefulness, right? Some of the don'ts are around like not in my backyard kinds of ethics and or you know, wrestles that our communities might have around renewable energy projects, wind turbines over, you know, visible wind turbines over invisible fossil fuel infrastructure, right? These are wrestles that we might have to work on, or you know, a tendency for parochialism, you know, that is more insular and inward turning, right? That's not placeful. That's kind of like a you know, that tendency to mistrust outsiders, right? And so this is some of the very valid criticisms of sense of place as a localistic strategy, is that, you know, we can be very prejudiced against outsiders if we see our boundary of place being, yeah, right. It's just being local only, right? And so we need to wrestle with that. And I mean, my sense of place is very much in my suburban neighborhood in Vancouver, because many times I have the option to get in the car. I could get in the car and drive to the North Shore, to the hiking trails in the forest that I love, the big, beautiful, iconic Douglas firs and Sitka spruce, or I could go for a walk to the abandoned, quarry that is now Queen Elizabeth Park, right? And watch what the family of ravens is doing in the cottonwood trees. There's no hints in my idea here that it has to be romantic, wild, even rural, right? It's digging into where and who we are, wherever that is. And that includes the cities, and that includes in making the cities more livable and urban green space and tree planting and community gardens, but it's not urban or rural. Yes. What was next? I think there was over here. Did you?
There was a hand over here for quite a while.
Go ahead.
No.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, well, I simply wanted to say that I want to thank you for your discussion of wilderness as a construct that really isn't appropriate. And I hadn't thought about that there is no such thing as a place that doesn't have the imprint of people in some way. And that makes me, I want to work with that. I really appreciate that concept of going out into the woods and realizing that this is not a place that people didn't exist or don't exist. And it never was,
right?
No matter where it is.
There are certainly lots of places in the world where we haven't had a whole lot of direct impact in terms of burning or managing for thousands and dozens of years. But in the world of climate change, every square inch of the planet is in some sense influenced by people. But that isn't to jettison the priorities of conservation, right? Biodiversity and protected areas are absolutely part of this strategy. But when you create a national park by eliminating its peoples who have lived in these places by their own reckoning from time immemorial, right? That's where we have this problem. And so the task is to learn the history of these places, not just the ecosystem paradigms function of a ecology that presumes that humans have nothing to do with them, or presumes that any human influence is only going to have a negative impact. That's where I start to take issue with the wilderness paradigm. Does that make sense? Yeah. And it actually has created quite a lot of misanthropy among environmental folks, because if your bar for ecosystem health is as it functions without any human influence, then you're tying your hands, right? And so the conversation in the media becomes the jobs versus owls kind of conversation, where the agrarians come in and say, we want to use you live in a house. What are you complaining about? I want to cut these trees. This is good jobs. We do this more sustainably than any other place on the planet. And then the response inevitably is to simply flip that on its head and say, well, the gold standard is wilderness, no people, nothing, right? Indigenous people knew that wasn't true. Their whole life was integrated into these places. Inukjuat don't have a word for wilderness. And our civilization in the West is struggling with what it might look like with so many people. There's no analogs for this. Right, but that's the kind of the direction we're moving. And someone named Emma Maris she's a journalist. She writes quite a lot about how we might be quite creative with nature in the cities and preserve wilderness, but also do some experimenting and some assisted migration for species that might need our help to survive climate change and not go extinct, like the white bark pine, some of the assisted migration we're doing with white bark pine, for example, or salmon, or you name it, right? There's lots of ways that human communities can be regenerative with the land. We just gotta sort out what that's going to look like, and get out of the way of Indigenous people when they say that they're going to do that, because most likely they're going to do that. They know in many ways, many of them still have the wisdom and the knowledge of their elders embedded in those places. So get out of their way, and then also figure out how to do it in our places and plantations and farms and cities and suburbs. All right, so we solved the world's problems. Yeah, one more time. Jillian, do you have time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to toss in with the talking about place. I think something that we need to remember in talking about place is it's all relational. And we have a relationship with whatever the place is. And that's constantly evolving. So that if we're looking for better ways to make a city place more sustainable with more nature in that city place, we're working and creating a better relationship with nature. And we're working on, restoration of environmental places. It's if we come at it rather than as, well, we humans know that we can do this and it'll make that better. But if we look at it as relationship, if they don't have a word for wilderness, it's because it's family.
That's right. It's home. It's family. Yeah.
We're kin.
Yeah.
And that was, I just wanted to throw that in because when I just finished up at Western this last spring, one of the last things I did, I taught a class called Dance, Nature, and Healing, and which was a wonderful experience, and did another lecture series called Embodied Inquiries into Nature. But I also contacted the administration about, since everybody's on a pronoun thing right now, so it's like, everybody wants to have correct pronouns at the university, and so they've set up a panel that agrees on what pronouns will be available. And so I put in a request to have he and kin added to that.
All right, this is Robin Mulcair.
So, yeah, because so I list mine as she, he, kin, and that acknowledges my sense of myself in relation to the world. So this is my responsibility and accountability to the world.
So that's Robin Wall Kimmer, The Grammar of Animacy is the article where she proposes that. Very cool. All right, well, let's talk amongst ourselves then. And if folks need to take off, I'm happy to stick around and meet you and have, and we have some more things to say. But my website, holyscapes.org, and I'm happy to share the slides because there's a lot of really good quotes. And I made sure to include page numbers because that always annoys me when presenters don't put page numbers. Okay. Please.
Can you offer to stay around and chat with people?
No, I'm going to stick around.
So I would like to just